colleagues. We can proceed now to this to our afternoon session. I am glad to present you the speakers of this table. Dr. Spyridoula Athanasopoulou-Kypriou. She is a religious education teacher at the known private school Moraitis in Athens and psychotherapist. She's specialized in the issues of gender theory. So she will speak about gender theories and constructive Orthodox theology, an Eschato-Christocentric understanding of sexuality and the body. And we will listen to you with great interest. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the organizers, especially Professor Moraitis, for inviting me to be here with you today. Allow me to start with repeating the title of my presentation: Gender Theories and Constructive Orthodox Theology, an Eschato-Christocentric understanding of sexuality and the body. Some Orthodox Christians are anxious and uncomfortable about gender diversity, transitions, and human sexualities. Others accuse gender theories of aggressive liberalism, permissiveness, and sinfulness. Their discomfort is often accompanied by homophobia. The case of Russia is exemplar. On the eve of the Winter Olympics in 2014, in Sochi, legislators introduced the anti-gay laws that opened the door to acts of discrimination and physical abuse. The Russian Orthodox Church under Patriarch Cyril chose accommodation with the regime and supported these laws. In 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and Orthodox Patriarch justified the war. He alleged that people were being suppressed and exterminated in eastern Ukraine. The object of the alleged suppression was an imagined resistance in Donbass to an imagined imposition by force of gay pride parades. Yet homophobia is not restricted to Russia. Helene Zordrager, who studies gender issues in relation to religious communities, argues for the homophobia shared by the majority of Orthodox churches in both Russia and Ukraine. Since 2006, the All Ukraine Council of Churches and Religious Organizations issued a series of condemnations of same-sex relations. In an analogous way, when in 2015 the Greek government expanded the law on civil unions to homosexual couples, the Holy Synod of Hierarchy of the Church of Greece issued a statement on the gay civil registered partnerships, in which it was noted that modern forms of organization of people's private lives constitute aberrations of the family institution as it has been shaped and operated for centuries in the life of the ecclesial body. Another hierarch, at the time Bishop of Aegion and Calavrita, issued a strong anti-gay statement saying homosexuality is a deviation from the laws of nature, it's a sin, so those who either experience it or support it are not normal people. They are scum of society. Don't hesitate. Then, when and wherever you meet them, spit on them. Given the Orthodox Church's negative attitude towards gender theories and sexual diversity, It does not come as a surprise that alternative gender identities and sexual diversity of Western societies are condemned specifically in the documents of the 2016 Council of Crete, and same-sex unions and relationships are considered completely incompatible with the teaching of the Church and authentic Orthodox Christian identity. According to the documents, pressure to recognize new forms of cohabitation constitutes a real threat for Orthodox Christians. The Church does not allow for her members to contract same-sex unions or any other form of cohabitation apart from marriage. The Church exerts all possible pastoral efforts to help her members who enter such unions understand the true meaning of repentance and love as blessed by the Church. The Orthodox Church seems to understand these issues as dangerous for Christians and as a rejection of God's intention for creation, being committed to conceptions of gender and sexuality which were formulated before the advent of modernity, overlooking the evidence of considerable variation in monastic living patterns and the practice of adelphopesis, brother making. There is a mistake there. That is the ritual affirmation of same-sex friendship emerged in Byzantine society. Following the findings of historians, it appears to me that the closer one looks at traditional Orthodox anthropology, the more one realizes that desires and sexual desires are viewed as a function of human passions. When correctly directed, they drive human beings closer to God, but when misdirected, they can drag them away from God. A telling example is the life of Saint Anthony, when Saint Athanasius gave an account of the temptations faced by Anthony while he was in desert. He presented that both a woman and a boy were considered appropriate objects for sexual gratification in the broader culture that Saint Anthony renounced when he fled to the desert. Holy tradition and Byzantine history offer striking witness to relationality as an instrument in the human advancement towards God and to embody desire as an ontological aspect of that effort. The historian Susan Ashbrook Harvey studies the sources and points out that history attests to both cross-sex and same-sex contexts for these fundamental themes, with both homo and heterosexual expressions. For Susan Ashbrook Harvey, one important ramification for the consideration of orthodoxy and homosexuality is the fact that the historical record cannot be reduced to one of consistent opposition. Additionally, sexuality and gender diversity have also been assumed to entail self-deception and mental ill health. Some Orthodox accept theories that suggest that lack of love during early childhood development, lack of love during early childhood development from the parent of the same gender as a child is the root cause of same-sex attraction. They then think, these Orthodox, that the appropriate reparative therapy can amend a person's sexual orientation, thus obscuring the realities of unique human persons and their relationships and causing distress to those who undergo such therapies. So from what I've said so far, I hope it has become clear that there is suspicion of new gender theories and an undisputed condemnation of contemporary sexual diversity. Within a Christian Orthodox context, which is mainly a national context, and often this context is a nationalist context, sexual or other practices which differ from the norms determined by the contemporary standards of the Orthodox Church can be regarded only as deviant and so ultimately unorthodox, on which grounds they are legitimately excluded from church history. From the point of view of informed historians, this is highly regrettable, since it gives the false impression that there exists a universal, transhistorical, and univocal Orthodox discourse on these matters, whereas it is very difficult to locate such a discourse in the sources. From the point of view of a theologian with a feminist agenda, the fact that the churches foment aggression and violence towards sexual minorities and to women and men who do not conform to the assigned gender roles is regrettable, since they convey to LGBTQ plus people in their own religious communities the message that they are wrong, abnormal, and sinful. Regretfully, it is common to suggest that LGBTQ plus folks should go and join the Episcopal Church or go and find another place to satisfy their spiritual yearnings. For me, it's go become an Episcopalian or go find another community to feel comfortable is the equivalent of telling them go to hell. Yet humans seem to be diverse, unique, and inherently transformative creatures with a vocation to shape their own worlds and traditions. Some people are looking for meaning in their lives, while others strive to remain faithful to their Orthodox tradition. People look for pastoral care. As the open letter from the European Forum of LGBT Christian Groups to the Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church, 2016, states, LGBT people are not necessarily outside the church. Many of them belong to the church. Therefore, I could not agree more with what Davor Zalto says, that the topic of non-heterosexual, including same-sex sexualities and sexual activities in the context of Orthodoxy, is not an alien or an abstract subject, relevant only for small circles of specialists, but something that affects church life on a daily basis. I think that Orthodox churches and their hierarchy need to respond to the plea of LGBTQ plus Christians for inclusion and to their call for an end to gender-based violence. I think that Orthodox theology and Orthodox theologians must engage in a constructive dialogue with contemporary gender theories, take seriously the new social facts and contemporary types of cohabitation, and develop a theology of sexuality. Admittedly, in recent years, some theological approaches have seen the light of day and tried to create and actually build a bridge between contemporary theories of gender, sexual diversity, and orthodoxy. Given the personhood theology, that is so much linked to Orthodox Church and Orthodox theology. So given this personhood theology and the fact that the ultimate goal of Christian Orthodox faith is theosis, translated as divinization and understood as transformation that involves transitions from one stage to the next, an attempt has been made by some Orthodox theologians to reframe the issues of gender diversity and transitions in constructive Christian Orthodox theological terms. Drawing upon the teachings of the fathers of the church, thinking with the Orthodox tradition and theology, resisting deficit-based discourses, avoiding essentialism, objectifications and exclusions, an attempt has been made to develop an Eschato-Christocentric understanding of sexuality and the body, and thus present gender diversity in a way that is positive and non-oppositional, in order to contribute both to the spiritual aspirations of all human beings who are marginalized, oppressed, and discriminated against on the basis of their gender identity and sexuality, and to the contemporary discourse about gender and sexuality. Judith Butler's work serves always as the starting point for any contemporary discussion on issues of gender and sexuality. Of course, there are other scholars. I simply refer to her because it's the starting point. She has provided an influential analysis of sex, gender, sexuality, and the body, and her contribution to gender theory involves a radical critique of identity categories in which not only gender, but also sex, sexuality, and the body are conceived as cultural products. For her, it's not that sex and gender produce heterosexuality, but that heterosexuality produces sex and gender in a binary form. For Butler, gender identifications are not something that are given in biology or that form some sort of essential self. An important aspect of her critique of identity is that the categories through which embodied subjects come into being are never fully determining. This allows for the possibility of resistance to gender identifications. But this is not to say that gender can be constituted at will. For Butler, to enter into the repetitive practices of this terrain of signification is not a choice, for the I that might enter is always already inside. There is no possibility of agency or reality outside the discursive practices that give those terms the intelligibility that they have. In a severe critique of Butler's opposition to norms and normative ideas, such as equality and dignity, and of her denial of any pre-cultural agency, the feminist political philosopher Martha Nussbaum wonders where the ability to resist to gender identification comes from if there is no structure in the personality that is not thoroughly culture's and power's creation. Let's go to what Sarah Coakley has to say. Her name was mentioned, I think, yesterday. So, following Nussbaum's criticism, the feminist theologian Sarah Coakley argues that although in Butler's analysis one detects a spiritual yearning for personal authenticity, Butler's theory of resistance is merely reinstating the conditions of sexual oppression against which Butler strives. Interesting point she made. So, whereas the starting point for gender studies is Butler, within Orthodoxy, theological anthropology begins from the first 3 chapters of Genesis. Genesis 1:27 says, so God created man, anthropos, in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. The Orthodox patristic scholar, Verna Harrison, the late, blessed be her memory, points out that despite the androcentrism of the late antique Mediterranean world in which they lived, nearly all the fathers conclude that men and women alike bear the divine image. Moreover, there is consensus among Orthodox theologians that being according to the divine image is intrinsic to our nature. It gives men and women the capacity to become like God or not. Intellect, freedom, and the capacity for virtue and communion with God are central properties of human nature that manifest the divine image and are shared by all human beings. Their nature thus makes all people, despite their peripheral properties, capable of likeness to God, communion with Him, and eternal life in the age to come, that is, salvation. Yet the ontological status of sex and gender, along with its implications, are a subject of lively debate. In other words, although there is agreement regarding the central properties of human nature, there is disagreement as far as the centrality and thus essentiality of sex and gender. Orthodox theologians like Paul Evdokimov and Father Thomas Hopko influenced by Russian religious philosophy, German Romanticism, and even evangelical Protestantism, are more inclined to see masculinity and femininity as ontological components of the human being, and male and female genders as created by God with separate complementary charisms and roles. But other Orthodox theologians draw upon the writings of the church, some church fathers, and review patristic teachings on gender, especially the teachings of Gregory of Nyssa and Maximus the Confessor, and are skeptical of the claim that sexual differentiation in humans is part of God's original intention and will persist in the resurrection. Current debates about anthropological issues revived theologians' interest in patristic thought and breathed new life into Eastern Orthodox tradition. Butler's thematization of gender fluidity and of subversive personal agency seem to echo older theistically oriented traditions. The denaturalization of sex and gender is a theme shared with an older tradition of ascetical transformation. Interestingly, Anglican and Roman Catholic feminist theologians, like the one mentioned before, Sarah Coakley and Tina Betty, as well as Orthodox theologians, argue for the relevance of the Eastern Orthodox tradition to contemporary issues of gender sexuality. It seems that many feminist theologians revisit the Eastern Orthodox tradition, particularly the works of Gregory of Nyssa and Maximus the Confessor, in order to find liberating resources. What these theologians try to do is to explore the different ways in which tradition might be interpreted in response to contemporary questions about sexuality. Yet academic honesty requires subscribing to Verna Harrison's observation that while Gregory's ideas are often highly suggestive and of relevance to contemporary discussions, it is essential to understand him in his own historical and theological context and not to make a simple equation between his anthropology and the philosophical or theological positions current in our time. I've got 5 minutes, I think, because we started a bit. We started a bit later. So in what follows, I draw very quickly upon the writings simply of Gregory of Nyssa in order to present, again, very briefly, 3 aspects of his theological reflections on gender and sexuality that could be employed in current discussions about sexual diversity, homosexuality, etc. And his ideas can also be employed in order to respond to LGBTQ+ people's plea for inclusion in the life of the church. So the first point, in his writings, Gregory of Nyssa argues for the stages of the soul ascent to God. Gregory presents his case for an anagogic lifestyle, according to which the ultimate goal of all the energy involved in sexuality is to intensify the desire of God. According to his threefold account of the stages of the soul's ascent to God, after having been illuminated and purified, and after having been transformed into something divine and sinless, the soul that is embodied and sexed enters within the secret chamber of the divine knowledge, and here she is entirely seized about by the divine darkness. This final stage, that is the state of unification with God through love, requires the soul's ultimate desire for God and is associated with the sacrament of Eucharist. The other point is that Gregory reflects on marriage and celibacy alongside one another using the same standards, that is, the goal of one's praxis, the goal of enkratia, physical celibacy, and the goal of marriage, etc. So sexual desire and physical attraction, be it for the opposite or the same sex, but in any case, for another soul, has to be reflected by the same exacting standards of progressive non-attachment and ascetical transformation. It seems that Gregory's appreciation of desire lies in the possibility of its transformation. Instead of craving after evil or desiring worldly things, the soul yearns for that mystical kiss. For all the purified soul wants is to bring her mouth to the fount of light, that is God. In other words, fleshly desire of all kinds can be treated as a divine gift and can thus be transformed into passionate desire for God. Gregory hopes that the soul will love God as much as the body has a bent for what is akin to it. For Gregory, if one has not experienced the motions of the flesh, one can find it difficult to transform desire and turn it toward God. The third point that can contribute to the current theological discussions about the human sexuality is Gregory's eschatologically oriented theory of gender that is understood in the context of his apophatic sensibility about the divine essence and his doctrine of double creation that can be interpreted as depriving sexual difference of any ontological significance. We do not have time to speak about this the idea, this teaching of double creation. So this apophatic turn has the capacity not only to undermine gender stereotypes, but to lead to a form of ever-changing modeling of desire for God. In terms of an eschatologically oriented gender theory, the denaturalization of sexual difference is invested with ontological validity. In other words, it is only within a Christocentric, ecclesial, and sacramental epistemological framework that the ontological claim there is no sexual difference is valid. The Christocentric and eschatologically oriented gender theory of Gregory subverts both gender essentialism and the culturally repressive web of sexual stereotypes. I will stop here because this last point is actually the point that can be relevant for today's discussion about this issue. Our section today was the relevance of orthodoxy for contemporary issues. Basically, the question is: has Orthodox theology anything to say today? My answer is yes, it has. It can contribute to a whole discussion about these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Athanasopoulou-Kypriou. We'll now proceed to the contribution of Reverend Dr. Timothy Boniface Carroll. He's Principal Research Fellow in the Department of Anthropology of University College London, London, UK, Director of the Center of Anthropology and Ethnography of Orthodox Christianity, and the Institute of Orthodox Christian Studies in Cambridge. So we have London and Cambridge. Well, that's great. So he is going to speak about the veracity of participation, quotidian mysteries in Orthodox Christianity as means to certainty. So, Father Timothy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation and for the joy of being here with you, Reverend Fathers, sister, beloved friends and colleagues. Let me start with a story. Apostolos and I stand at a bar-height table in the herbalist shop. The oscillating hum of the generator reverberates off the stone walls, giving an acoustic quality to the 16th century building that feels strange and incongruous. To add to the apparent incongruity, a couple hundred bottles of freshly infused soft soap stand in front of us on the table. From a box to my right, I pull the plastic depressor lids one by one, screw them down taut upon the calendula-scented soft soap. I place each in turn in front of Apostolos. He takes a bottle, peels the back from a label and sticks the label on the plastic bottle. He places the bottle among its sisters in a crate. With a bold image of a calendula flower, the label declares it in English and Greek to be the product of the holy great monastery of Vatopedi. As we move bottles, and as the cycle of the generator allows, Apostolos and I chat. He is from a small village down the coast of Athens and comes to Vatopedi regularly. He likes it here, he says, though he cannot exactly tell me why. He comes as often as he can, first with his uncle, but now on his own. I ask him if he wants to become a monk, and he says, no, he is too young to decide that. For now, he is looking at studying biology and maybe immigrating to England. This was before Brexit, so it was still an appealing thing. He starts asking me why I have come to Greece and to a monastery. Are you going to become a monk? And I explained that it was part of my research as an anthropologist. He did not know what that meant, so we discussed anthropology. And as he sees what I'm doing, he impresses upon me the etymology of anthropos, saying, you must know that anthropos means the one who looks up. That is to say, we, humans, are not just bodies like the animals. We also have a spirit. And obviously we can discuss etymology if you want, but that's a different question. Apostolos explained to me that the one who looks up means that as humans, we are not satisfied with what is on the surface of things alone. Rather, it is the human instinct to seek for what is invisible, what is immaterial, because the human is both body and spirit. He asks me if I have read Plato, and happy to see that I have, he invokes the image of the chariot race from the Phaedrus. This is what it means to be human, he says, with the implication that this is what I need to know for my research, to look up and to see what is in heaven. Returning again to a question I asked him earlier, I asked, is that why you have come to the monastery? Is it how you look up? Yes, he says thoughtfully, one of the ways. Apostolos felt it was very important to take into account, that I take into account the aspect of humanity as the one that looks up in my research. Following his leading answer that coming to the monastery was one of the ways in which he looks up, I asked for other examples. His list was short, the liturgy, and simply this. He held up in his left arm, showing a gomboskini tied around his wrist. A placeholder, of course, for the hesychastic prayer, the prayer of silence practiced by many in the Orthodox Church. I asked for other examples, and he shrugged and looked up and saw an icon of the Theotokos on the wall, and he pointed. The generator oscillated into a loud cycle, and the din echoed in the old stone chamber. He took the opportunity to stop the conversation and returns to saying, Kyrie Jesu Christe eleison me. This conversation with Apostolos was quite typical of those that I had with other Orthodox Christians over the years. When engaging in conversation about their lives and their aspirations, I am referred back to the liturgy, to an icon or other similar object, such as a prayer rope, a prayer book, a relic, incense, or agiasma. As such, Apostolos' view of looking up, what he sees as the principal aspect of being human, can be seen to connote a truly wide understanding of the Orthodox process of religious becoming. Apostolos' hesitancy to list the ways in which he sought to look up was not an inability on his part to articulate ways through which he could see the heavenly parade, to use the image from Plato's Phaedrus, but rather his doubt that I had the ability to fathom the reality to Orthodox Christians. Obviously, I wasn't dressed in black at the time. Not knowing where to begin, he returned to prayer. I saw him for the last time a few days later, and he said a warm goodbye and reminded me to keep in mind that to be human was to look up. I would like to propose in this talk that postmodernity is a great boon for the Orthodox Church. This take is positioned in part on the emphasis of the postness of postmodernity as a reprieve from the horrors of modernity. I'm working here from the initial assumption that modernity is a horror, and anything moving past it, even if in the wrong direction, to some sense, is a move in the right direction. I will therefore sketch out in the broadest of strokes the problems of modernity, and after this I will move towards sketching out the horrors of postmodernity. Then within this landscape of epistemological apocalypse, I will focus on the beauty of postmodernity and its mindset and the ways in which this might prove a boon for Orthodox Christianity. If we are lucky, we will return to the apostolic witness, if you will forgive my play on his name, and consider looking up. One of the ironies of modernity is that a key aspect of its epistemological framework is an appeal towards critical, objective knowledge, the view of reality as it is, achieved through a scientific, rational, and non-subjective stance. As the anthropologist of citizen science and astronomy, Patrick Edgley, has argued, this quotation now, modernity is a process which seeks to make the world and its occupants legible and manageable through technical fixes and standardization, end quotation. The irony is simply that this cannot exist. It is impossible, as the observer is implicated in the phenomenon, and to deny this is to arbitrate an artificial division in the fabric of the phenomenon. However, in trying to achieve the neutral objective view, the work of modernity is to separate oneself from the world. This act of particularization is done through various acts of classification of the world out there. To be modern is to make objects of both the ego or the self and the other, and then to claim revelation. The problem modernity poses for scholars of modernity is one of separation anxiety. One cannot know thyself in a pre-modern Delphic fashion if true knowledge is objective and external without divorcing one's cognition from oneself. This is, of course, how modern notions of selfhood and intersectionality, intersectional identity arose. As such, it is maybe best to study what modernity is at the borders of modernity, or indeed beyond its borders, looking in, because the unbiased, objective view required by modernity can, to be certain, not be found if one is within it. It must be attained by a distanced, objective view from the outside. The only way to gain a modern view of modernity is to study it from a pre- or postmodern vantage point. Otherwise, the research bias will render the science void. To this end, within the anthropological literature, we see that modernity is most clearly an idea. And to quote Webb Keen, as an idea, it has a pervasive and powerful role in the popular imagination wherever we look, end quote. The nature of this idea, however, has a wide variety. Modernity can be the acquisition of an unimaginable wealth, or to have a life without labor, where goods are available at the push of a button, or life is lived without illness. Webb Keen notes that for the Sumba in Indonesia, where he's done extensive field work, modernity, quote, is surely much softer. The food in modernity is surely much softer than their own maize, tubers, and rice. It is the general idea of greatness, comfort, order. We had some really good soft food, by the way. The vegetables were, Thus, to be modern, to claim oneself as modern, or to say they over there are not modern, is a moral accusation. It is a classificatory act, a judgment. It is to place a practice or person in a category. To claim this or that, me or them as modern, is to perform an act of objectification. Again, quoting Webb Keen, modernity is distinguished by what I, Webb Keen, call objectification, and that objectification has serious consequences for the human subjects. Objectification, at least in the more common negative uses of the word, is more often invoked than defined. Those who use the term often assume we should by now know what it is and what is wrong with it. It connotes a lack of agency and even motion, a distancing from the world, a lack of self-recognition and abuse of others, end quotation. In this moral act of objectification, modernity attempts to accomplish a form of representation, which claims absolute insight into the represented. The scholar, the scientist, the statement, the expert is someone who is able to pronounce a true view upon the conditions as they are. However, following another anthropologist, Timothy Mitchell, Keen notes that, quote, representations offer a privileged location to a viewer such that both viewer and model clearly stand apart from reality being represented, rendering that reality as an object. Thus, Mitchell tells us, is distinctly modern and Western, end quotation. What we're playing at is an epistemological framework that claims the mind as separate from, with a neutral objective view of, the world. However, this leads to a crisis. And I again quote from Patrick Edgley. The uprooting and abstraction of concepts, what has been called making knowledge mobile or durable, is not only a feature of science, but also of modernity that deploys it to its own ends of management, of simplifying the world into abstract essences that can be extracted and moved and transplanted and sold. I have, that is Patrick, has discussed this mobility in conceptual terms as a means by which information can be applied to other realms so that they may be linked and used to make structuring models. But this work is also seen literally in the equally modernist practice of extractive capitalism. This is what Anna Tsing, another anthropologist, calls the modern human conceit, which, and now we're quoting Anna Tsing, entangles us with the ideas of progress and with the spread of techniques of alienation that turn human beings and things into resources and won't let description be anything more than a decorative footnote. Now, anthropology being a descriptive science, we take this as a particular insult, the idea that description is removed to a decorative footnote. Now, so in their work, Edgley is discussing astronomy as practiced among citizen scientists. Working with a similar question about visual representation, however, the practice of taking an objective, perfect image of a planet or a star, etc., ultimately proves impossible. There is always something wrong, even after fixing for the weather and reducing human error through fancy mounted motorized telescopes and cameras, even after finding a secluded location away from the light pollution of urban centers. There will always be something, the material of the lenses itself, as it captures and shapes the light, casting its mark and rendering the image, what Don Ide calls the material hermeneutics at play in the acquisition of scientific knowledge, or simply the fact that all earthly vision of the heavens is bound by the human conditions, by Earth's atmosphere, by the perspective of the human eye, with our limited color spectrum. No matter how much we might claim to a post-Copernican heliocentric worldview, astronomy done from the Earth's surface will always be condemned to a certain form of geocentrism. There is, Edgley notes, no way to have a pure, objective, scientific image. And the amateur astronomers that they work with knows this. And Edgley demonstrates how this failure of the image correlates to a larger systemic failure, what he calls a collapse of modernity. He says, With the connection between amateur astronomy and the collapse of modernity is as implicit as the existence of a tactile scientific subject. I believe that there are solid grounds upon which to claim that this is nonetheless the case. Astronomy meetings are not just 6-hour solid discussions of astronomy, but opportunities to catch up with old friends and talk about the world, i.e. the context in which they live and do their cosmic work. That is Patrick's, anthropological interpretation is to link the pessimism, despair, confusion, and horror that usually defines discussions of the wider world to the failure of the image by means of the failure of the modern project to manage the world through human reason into a state of ceaseless progress. The apocalypse, he claims, is an apocalypse of rational agency, the loss of faith in our capacity to know and manage. He is not talking about a religious situation here, right? He is not drawing on religious theological understandings of the apocalypse. This is entirely arising from contemporary popular discussions of what apocalypse is and how it gets used in this literature that he's working with. Thus, this is now my work in quotation, thus the horror of modernity is its own collapse, as its own methods prove impossible. The attempt at rational agency, the capacity to know and manage the world and ourselves is ultimately impossible. Thus we see a, quote, loss of faith in modernity's capacity to know and manage. Thus, out of the rotting corpse of modernity, that lived on well past its years through the artificial mechanisms of the industrial life support systems, comes the maggots that are post-modernity. Now, what is post-modernity? For my purposes here, I will define it with a list of 2 attributes. 1, post-modernity is characterized by the lack of a grand narrative. And 2, post-modernity is characterized by the lack of an external authority. While modernity sought to know and manage on a grand scale everything, its collapse has rendered any grand narrative appear as an emperor with no clothes. In the successive black swan events of the last 2 decades, the financial collapses, the bubbles, the bursts, the failed not wars for freedom and democracy, so-called, the failed democracies, and the slow dawn of consciousness following the drunken orgy of the colonial order, the list goes on. We have come to a point where many people have lost faith in the expert. The mantra of the pandemic to follow the science is but one beautiful example of how the modernist project of ceaseless project, what Edgley describes as the Cartesian engine, reaches terminal velocity and falls apart. Now, as an anthropologist, I'm always dubious of statistics, as they are a bit like osteomancy, the telling of fortune from bones, an attempt to tell one's fortune from the relics of a dead life. Nonetheless, a set of statistics that have conveniently come available recently, that of Peter Brearley's 2021 edition of Church Statistics number 4, notes the percentile change in English Sunday church attendance between 1980 and 2020. As one might expect, the Church of England has a marked decline over this 40-year period, with attendance in the C of E dropping by 45%. Roman Catholics have experienced a startling 55% drop in the same period, but that still looks healthy compared to the United Reform results at a rather startling 74% decline in church attendance in this 40-year period. Against this appalling landscape of Christian decline and secularization, 2 groups went against the general trend and witnessed growth during this period. Interestingly, in terms of data and taxonomical representation, while each of the named denominations declined, the 2 groups that grew are not named denominations. Rather, they are listed as Pentecostals, which is like a manifold thousands of them, with a seismic growth of 95% increase in Sunday church attendance between 1980 and 2020 in England, and the Orthodox with a somewhat shocking 279% growth over the same period. This presents us with something of a problem. Why is there this growth? One can discount some of these numbers due to immigration, particularly Romanian immigration into the UK during the Irenic years of mutual participation in the European Union. But from the conversations with clergy from other Orthodox dioceses in the UK, as well as with Pentecostal bishops, ministers, and similar, it is clear that this is not just immigration. Something is happening. As suggested already, the long-awaited collapse of modernity has left the quote-unquote rational Western mind bereft of the scaffolding by which it atomizes itself from itself. It is left with a post-modernity characterized by the lack of grand narrative and the lack of external authority. Truth be told, even this distinction is an artificial one, as the grand narrative is itself a form of external authority. So it is unnecessary repetition. However, humor me. I think it is useful to think in pairs. The rejection of an external authority is not a rejection of all authority or truth, really, as truth becomes subjective. In the prophetic words of the dude from the 1998 film The Big Lebowski, yeah, well, you know, that's just like your opinion, man. The individuated, atomized, self-objectified attempt at rational taxonomic classification is itself the only possible authority. This, however, is wildly depressing, which gives rise to another element of postmodernity, a great malaise, the ennui, the sense of nihilism as an art form, a culinary delight, so devoid of meaning, purpose, or drive, but living a life of moderate prosperity, or at least having access to soft foods. What is left is a subtle minuet, if you will, a dance in triple time between the morose certainty of uncertainty and the macabre doubt of such certainty. I think it is no accident that the two groups in the United Kingdom, and similar narratives suggest the trend is also true in the Americas and elsewhere, that the groups that have experienced growth are those that emphasize a personal experience. While there is a high and deep theology, circles of complex interlocking concepts, etc., and funny words borrowed from old languages and orthodoxy, as it exists in the West, this is not necessarily required. Orthodox Christians, for better or worse, have not historically done door-to-door evangelism. And while St. Paul went to synagogues to debate theology and stood in the public forum to dispute with Athenian philosophers, we seem to have long given up that evangelism technique. Rather, if I had to boil down Orthodox missiology, it would have to be simply come and see. It is beguilingly simple. It is almost uncouth. It requires two things, but utterly innocuous. It invites the person to approach on their own timing when they are ready. And it invites them to witness for themselves what is within orthodoxy. During the pandemic and the glut of Orthodox services being offered online, even the come part was made negotiable. This invitation to witness, or what elsewhere might be described as a theology of participation, is a critical element here. The postmodern malaise primes people to want something, a grand narrative, a sense of purpose or order, but the rejection of authority means that evangelism, or even apologetics as it's traditionally understood, is largely useless and often toxic to this generation. But in coming and seeing, there is no external expert, or rather, the external expert is so busy singing litanies up at the front that they can't really exert authority. The person can experience at their own pace something, and as a priest, I would hope also someone. It is no accident that in chrismation, the church anoints the faculties of the sensory perception. As Jill Dubish mentions in her work on Orthodoxy and Tinos, it is a tactile and sensuous religion. In coming to see, the person is invited to, possibly for the first time, look up. Thus, I would suggest that in the Orthodox and Pentecostal emphasis on personal experience, on participation, the lost, atomized bundle of identities is allowed to be human, if they want to be. In coming to see, they can become one who looks up. The timing of subsequent stages are not, in my experience, particularly regular. Metropolitan Jonah of the OCA recently suggested in a public talk that it would likely take 30 years before the catechumen theologians and the orthobros and the online elders would have the spiritual maturity to actually meaningfully discuss the concepts like the essences and the energies that they have been bandering about on Twitter and Reddit and the like. I'm not sure about this, and as I have only been Orthodox for 15 years, I am content to say that I do not have the spiritual maturity to agree or disagree with him. However, as an anthropologist, I think it is very clear that the come and see is not solely done to the temple. That is to say, just as our apostolic witness suggested at the beginning of this talk, looking up comes in an endless variety. While the participation in the liturgy is certainly central, and the growth of maturity of people in the church is largely related to the mundane, boring things done outside the liturgical setting. A life of prayer, guarding one's thoughts, doing good deeds, all of these are central to the faith. In the title of this paper, the concept of quotidian mysteries comes from the work of Kathleen Norris. She is principally a novelist and poet, but in her book, The Quotidian Mysteries, Laundry, Liturgy, and Women's Work, she offers a theological reflection derived by her years first as a Presbyterian in the Great Plains and then as a Benedictine oblate. She says, and I'm very close to the end, but I am going to quote her at some length, forgive me. It is a paradox of human life that in worship, as in human love, it is in the routine and the everyday that we find the possibilities for the greatest transformation. Both worship and housework often seem perfunctory, and both, by the grace of God, may be anything but. At its Latin root, the perfunctory means to get through with, and we can easily see how literally liturgy, laundry, and what has traditionally been conceived of as women's work can be done in that indifferent spirit. But the joke is on us. What we think we are just getting through with has the power to change us, just as we have the power to transform what seems meaningless, the endless repetitions of litanies or the motions of vacuuming the floor. What we dread as mindless activity can free us, mind and heart, for the working of the Holy Spirit, and repetitive motions are conducive to devotions such as the Jesus Prayer, the Rosary, and anything is fair game for prayer. Anything or anyone can pop into our minds and be included. How are we doing on time? Perfect. I do not want to expand the list of sacraments, particularly given our earlier paper, to include laundry and hoovering. But there is something very true about the labor of love of perfunctory tasks as an arena of spiritual struggle. What Norris frames here as being characteristic of women's work, and I think she's nodding to Hannah Ardent's concept here as well, I think is true more broadly. It is, I think, human. And we should not be surprised by this. After all, as we just heard, women are humans first and foremost. I hope it's okay for me to say such controversial things. This basic ability to achieve the greatest transformation via tasks that we must simply get through is also present in monastic obedience. It is also present really in all Orthodox Christian life, or at least should be on some level. In archaeology and in wider material culture studies, there's a concept of the skeuomorph. This is an element of design that used to be functional, a necessary component of the construction of the object, but is now purely decorative. So if you think of basketry, where you make a clay handle that looks like it's woven from reeds, that would be a classic skeuomorph. In the liturgy, we have this as well. All the catechumens depart, let none of the catechumens remain, and the doors, and wisdom let us attend. These liturgical skeuomorphs are helpful, though, as reminders that the Orthodox faith is progressive, that is, beginning with feeding on milk, says St. Paul, and later to be given solid food. Modernity, as I have mentioned already, is soft food. Post-modernity is probably reduced fat, organic almond milk. But orthodoxy allows a person to show up, see a little, and maybe join in, possibly for the wrong reasons. Glory to God. But as they participate, as they look up and see, as they perform the perfunctory tasks of saying their daily prayers, of doing the dishes, of maybe biting their tongue instead of gossiping, as they start to fill their house with icons and develop opinions about the appropriate length and place to wear a kombuskini, or which Athenite father is their favorite, or which YouTube talking head is currently correct about the pandemic, little by little, bit by bit, the way they think will, inshallah, change. What exactly the mind of the church is, of course, is beyond my remit, as I'm not a theologian. But I think it has to do with how logic works. As I have argued elsewhere, aesthetics is a system of logic, a form of reasoning by which new formations of the same core elements are produced. In the Orthodox context, this logic is largely analogical, that is, understanding by analogy. And so as a person comes into the church, the way they wash the dishes can be transformed, and eventually an overarching narrative of God and his abiding mercy can be built within their soul. When Apostolos was faced with the impossibility of explaining all the ways to look up and thus to be anthropos, to a rather daft xeno-anthropologist, he simply demonstrated it. He stopped talking. He attended to the perfunctory task of bottling scented soaps and recited, Lord Jesus Christ and the God, have mercy upon me, the sinner.
Thank you, Father Timothy. And we move to the lecture of Dr. Christopher Johnson, who is Senior Instructional Designer, Walker Center for Teaching and Learning, University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. Yeah. Okay, USA. So his lecture is about waving robes from sand. So we are still discussing in the monastic milieu, I think, but this is about the role of Orthodox Christianity in the postmodern age of indulgent machines. I have the floor, Christopher.
Thank you. Yeah. So first of all, thank you, a profound thank you to the organizers, Dr. Moschos and Dr. Kalatzidis, also the Volos staff for being so amazing, and all of the participants. I've really enjoyed my first time in Volos, so thank you for everybody's participations in this. Father Boniface pointed out the irony that I'm talking about AI, but I have a paper, an actual paper that I'll be reading from, but I do have some images, you'll be glad to know. Those will mostly be saved for the end of the talk. So you can just have this nice backdrop for now. So first, two preparatory remarks before I get into the heart of the paper. First, the statements that I'm gonna go over today are definitely provisional and tentative. I feel like that's maybe a benefit of speaking about a topic that not many people have spoken about in the Orthodox circles, at least that I know of, or are published about. So, you know, it is provisional, and I may change my mind tomorrow. Maybe one of you will change my mind. So, but these are my current thoughts about not AI in general, but generative AI. So that's the second point I wanted to mention, is that I'm not going to be speaking about artificial intelligence in general. As some of you may know, it's absolutely pervasive in society, even if you don't call it that, whether it's the subtitle or the captioning on Zoom, or, you know, blurring your background, or autonomous weapons, self-driving cars, Google Translate. There's so many uses of AI that are out there that people don't even think about. It's just part of their tools. So I'm not going to be speaking about AI in general, but more on generative AI, which is what some of you may have heard about, ChatGPT. It comes up in a lot of student papers. Also, DALL-E is not the painter, but the OpenAI's image generator, as opposed to language generator. So those are going to be the two tools that I talk about. So if you hear ChatGPT and DALL-E, that's what I'm talking about, is those generative AI tools that OpenAI created. All right, so the expression weaving ropes of sand is an expression used by Saint Irenaeus in Against Heresies to describe how Valentinian Gnostics during his day were throwing together an assortment of non-scriptural passages to support their own worldview. The phrase suggests a doomed effort to create the substantial from the insubstantial, or at least give such an appearance. Wet sand in the shape of a rope may temporarily fool an observer, but when investigated further and put to the test of pulling oneself out of a pit, it would quickly crumble and be of no practical use. Later in this passage, St. Irenaeus compares the Gnostics' approach to rearranging the tessera of a mosaic of a king into the image of a fox and convincing people it's the image of a king. Maybe some of you have heard this phrase before. I chose the title of for this paper because I believe both of these descriptions from Against Heresies are striking ways to imagine and describe the current state of generative artificial intelligence. The products of these tools give the appearance of a coherent, meaningful whole, but they're actually a kind of optical illusion that only give the impression of wholeness and resemblance to reality. In fact, they are simulacra. Jean Baudrillard uses this term simulacra to describe signs that have become disconnected with the reality to which they point. Since simulacra are hard to distinguish from the reality on which they are originally based, they can eventually replace that reality, a state Baudrillard describes as hyperreality. The pervasiveness of simulacra and hyperreality is considered by some as a hallmark of postmodernity. And I would argue that generative AI is to date the clearest technological distillation of this characteristic. One increasingly well-known example of this effect of hyperreality is the proliferation of deepfake photos, audio, and videos that make it increasingly difficult to distinguish reality from simulacra and presents a postmodern hall of mirrors where representations seem to have no real, original, stable, or objective source. In this case, generative AI can act as a weapon against reality, or truth, in what many call a post-truth society. Like any technology, generative AI can also have positive uses in some cases, yet it's worth bearing in mind that not only are there many large social impacts, especially downstream, generative AI is really deceptive by design. That's the point of it, by convincingly imitating human thinking, activity, and relationships, which I'll talk about. I'm not suggesting that generative AI should be avoided, but that deep reflection should at least give us pause in its use and cause us to question its deeper meaning. And actually, many AI researchers agree, and many of them have signed petitions, a moratorium on progressing with this technology because they're worried about the implications, both social and technological. The situation of hyperreality has already and will increasingly lead to a widespread nostalgia for a more sacramental and re-enchanted worldview, a worldview that prioritizes what AI lacks: deep interiority, the material world as good, embodied spiritual practices, one may say quotidian spiritual practices, and relational communion. Orthodox Christianity has an opportunity to offer these aspects of its rich tradition as anchors amidst the coming wave of sweeping technological and social change, to use the phrase of AI pioneer Mustafa Suleyman. The book is called Coming Wave. I would recommend it if you're interested. These elements of our tradition have authenticity because they are not only responses to the current moment, but have been consistently lived over many centuries. This paper will suggest 3 areas in which Orthodoxy can contribute with practices that go against the grain of the worldview that generative AI represents. I will begin by looking at 3 aspects of Christology: Christ as Word, as icon, and as Son of God. These characteristics will be linked to 3 understandings of humanity's image of God, namely rationality, dominion, and relationship. I will follow theologian Noreen Hertzfeld by linking these 3 different ways, these 3 different images of God, or ways of understanding that, to 3 different ways in which AI is made in our image, namely the attempt to mirror human thinking, acting in the place of humans, and being in relationship with us. Next, I will sketch out the Orthodox practices and perspectives that challenge the assumptions that underlie technologies that artificially generate speech, images, and relationships. Lastly, I will assess several examples of AI-generated text and images related to orthodoxy. I should note at the outset of this paper that I will not speculate on where these technologies are headed in the future, or attempt to discern whether the spirit that underlies them is divine or demonic. There have been other thought-provoking pieces out there that take stances like that. Both of those issues, such as one by David Bentley Hart, or a couple of essays by Paul Kingsnorth, that are more critical, I would say, that take on such questions. Instead, I am restricting my analysis to the relationship between the postmodern and or transhumanist worldview that is represented by these tools in the theological vision and praxis of orthodoxy. Okay, this is part one. An Orthodox Christian reflection on generative AI must be based in the faith's theology and anthropology. This means starting from the person of Jesus Christ, who is Word of God, image of God, and person in Trinity, and our Son of God. As Word of God, Christ reveals the mind and will of the Father, including his role in creating and affirming the goodness of the world through speech. In the Old Testament, God was known and heard primarily through his creative and prophetic word, but remained invisible except for appearing to a chosen few. As image of God, Christ makes the Father visible and immediately present to the world, and by taking on matter and flesh, acts as his representative and co-regent on earth. Christ does this to refashion the fallen image of humanity and transfigure the world by raising it up as creation's priest, uniting the humanity he's taken on in all of creation with his divinity. In the New Testament, Christ reveals himself as both word and image of the Father and reveals them to be one and the same. Lastly, Christ exists eternally as person in Trinity. In other words, he is a person in a continual perichoretic relationship with the Father and the Spirit, and does all things in common with them. This is seen primarily in obviously Trinitarianism, but also in his title as Son of God. It's a relational title. One aspect of the creative act of the Word, icon, and Son of God is to create humans who are also made in the image and according to the likeness of God. Little words, icons, and sons and daughters that mirror their prototype. Just as Christ, the Word, reveals the mind of the Father, we are called to name and order creation by the use of creative speech and human reason. Just as Christ, the image, makes the Father visible and acts on his behalf to restore our image and all of creation, we are called to be icons and transfigure the world through creative action by acting according to God's will as creation's caretakers. Just as Christ, the Son, is essentially relational, we too are made to be relational beings and are defined as persons by how we relate to God, other people, and the rest of the world, including our own creations and tools. The relational nature that we share with God also corresponds to the covenant God has made with humanity. Therefore, the Imago Dei involves the calling and potential to grow into likeness with God by revealing God's mind, presence, and relationality in the world and to the world. We are intended to offer up our words, actions, and relationships in relation to the entire created world in thanksgiving, just as Christ does. These three descriptions of Christ, Word, icon, and Son, correspond to different ways the image of God has been defined throughout history by Christian theologians and historians as reason, dominion, or relationship. And it's usually or, because those are usually contrasted. Much ink has been spilled arguing for the supremacy of one of these views. Yet we see here that all are essential to what it means to be human, just as all are essential to Christ is. Noreen Hertzfeld, in her book, In Our Image, surveys these views of the Imago Dei and links the three views to three related senses of what she calls the Imago Hominis, image of humanity. Using AI, we have attempted to create machines in our own image that replicate human thought, act in our stead, or relate to us. Ultimately, Hertzfeld says that while machines can replicate many elements of human reason and action in creation, they cannot have meaningful relationships with humans because there's not mutual freedom involved. We'll see later in the paper that chatbots don't necessarily agree with that. One area of Christian anthropology not directly addressed by Herzfeld is the place of human creativity in our role as the image of God. As Christ is our prototype, we are also made in his divine image as creators who continue God's creative process. One of the few Orthodox thinkers that reflects on this aspect of the image at length is Nikolai Berdyaev, who says that in creativeness, man himself reveals the image and likeness of God in him. Berdyaev relates creativeness, in his term, closely with human freedom and argues that creativeness is made possible by Christ's redemption, which restores our creative freedom. It's part of our telos and works toward the transfiguration of the world into the kingdom of God. And also he links it to deification. Berdyaev also says that every creative act, in essence, is creation out of nothing, the production of new forces rather than the changing or rearranging of the old. One may take issue with this ex nihilo view of creativity, but it's helpful in seeing the contrast to generative AI, which is really a pastiche of human creations that often hides its human origins. So now I'll talk a little bit about that. One might assume that creativity is a uniquely human ability, but some studies are beginning to claim that a tool like ChatGPT, the language generator, exhibits what we might call creativity. In one study, researchers used ChatGPT to take an alternate uses test that's typically used to demonstrate divergent or out-of-the-box thinking in humans. In this test, a person, or in this case, an AI, is asked how an object can be used, and the more unusual uses are given a higher score. ChatGPT scored higher than most people in the test, but the more creative humans that scored the highest still scored higher than ChatGPT for now. So, yay, humans. Yet we must remind ourselves that the large language model behind this tool is simply generating a plausible sequence of words based on probabilities. There's no understanding of what innovative use of an object actually means, since there's no conscious experience in the model. Most experts agree. Some maybe don't, but most do. The model is, in effect, trained to trawl through existing human texts and assemble a possible arrangement of characters, maybe a likely one based on probabilities. Only an impoverished and reductive view of human cognition and creativity would describe it in these same terms, at least in my view. Okay, next part. In her book, God, Human, Animal, Machine, Megan O'Giblin, it's also a good book, I'd recommend. Megan O'Giblin says, the central pillar of this ideology, she's speaking of digital technology, is its conception of being, which might be described as an ontology of vacancy, a great emptying out of qualities, content, and meaning. She has an interesting argument behind that, but I don't have much time for that. AI, such as ChatGPT, is emblematic of this ideology, strings of characters that are generated not by reference to their inherent meaning, but to statistical and probabilistic patterns and petabytes of data. In the face of this ontology of vacancy, Orthodox Christians need to affirm an ontology of fullness. What St. Paul says of Christ, in whom the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily, spills over into what we create. This ontology of fullness means that creation itself is sacramental and iconographic. Humans and the rest of the created world have been filled to overflowing with God's immanent presence in the incarnation, and thus we can transmit grace through our co-creations. We can apply this ontology of fullness to the various creative aspects of the Imago Dei already mentioned, the words, images, and relationships that we create and value. The words, the images, and relationships we create and value should reflect this ontology rather than an ontology of vacancy. Here's the three aspects of Orthodox practice and theology that I would suggest. I'm sure there are more. The tradition of contemplative prayer is an important part of the Orthodox response to the ontology of vacancy in relation to words. The apophatic tradition insists that God is not limited by our categories of thought and language, and thus encountering God in prayer is fundamentally a non-discursive experience. This idea, expressed in Romans 8, we don't know what we should pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself makes intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. This idea is expressed in that passage. The entire Orthodox contemplative tradition can be seen as an inversion of the ontology of vacancy, where there are many words pieced together by probabilities with no meaningful intention. Instead, God is approached either through silent prayer, or simple words repeated with increasing intentionality and relationality, such as the Jesus prayer. I have done some research in the past about the growth of the use of Jesus prayer outside of Orthodox circles. And I think that a practice like this will probably only become more attractive beyond Orthodox borders because of, well, the digital landscape, but especially tools like these that generate human words. In this case, language, and especially the name of God, can sacramentally bring together the visible and invisible, the divine and human. The aim of all prayer, and especially contemplative prayer, is to fill our words with meaning, presence, and intention by unifying the self and putting this full self in loving relation to God and creation. Using words in this way is a challenge and a response to the vacant words of digital glossolalia generated by statistical patterns and data. One of the primary creative acts in the history of the Orthodox Church has been the painting of holy icons. Icons are images created by those made in the image of God, of saints who have gained likeness to God by being conformed to Christ, the image of the original prototype. In other words, icons are images created by images of the image. I banged my head on that one for a while when I wrote that. As Leonid Ouspensky says, what is essential for authenticity in iconography is a resemblance to the prototype depicted. The reason for this is that there must be a resemblance for the worshiper to participate in the event or person depicted and thus be transformed by the participation. Not only does the transfigured person in the icon offer an opportunity for transfiguration in the worshiper who gazes on it, but the activity of iconography itself can be a path to holiness. The non-naturalistic resemblance in an icon is to the saint as they have been transfigured by grace and overcome fragmentation. This resemblance is based on a system of symbolism to depict individual saints in their transfigured state and has been passed down through manuals and tradition. The materials in traditional iconography represent, in his words, Ouspensky's words, the most complete participation of the visible world in the creation of an icon. So wood represents the vegetable, glue and egg, the animal, and chalk and paint, the mineral. All this, in his words, is gathered in its natural state, purified and brought to partake of worship through the work of man. This shows the fundamentally sacramental view behind the use of icons. Thine own, we offer unto you on behalf of all and for all. But for Ouspensky, the limit between what is acceptable and unacceptable in the domain of matter is crossed when matter loses its authenticity and character, when it gives the appearance of being other than it is, when it too creates a deception. In the image, he says, illusion is as intolerable as in the spiritual life, asceticism, and prayer. So this can be contrasted, I would say, with the artificial generation of images by AI, such as DALL-E. There's others out there, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, but they're proliferating. In the case of image generation, the AI is trained using diffusion models to destroy the data structure of an image by adding noise and then rebuilding the image. The image generation then starts with pure noise, digital noise, and then uses predictions from the training to generate a new image. In other words, the very basis of artificial image generation is the deconstruction of the unity of the image and the reassembly based on probabilities. Generated images do not resemble any prototype, but are in another AI pioneer, Jaron Lanier's terms, a mashup of artifacts. He calls it, instead of generative AI, mashup AI, because that's what's happening, is bringing together all these images or words and putting them in some pattern. They have an uncanny resemblance, generated images, to possible real objects and people in the world, but they're ultimately illusory or illusions. Lanier compares AI to the Talmud, and he says the primary difference is that, quote, the Talmud doesn't hide people. You can see differing human perspectives within the compound object, end quote. In contrast to a generated digital mashup, Orthodox iconography offers an embodied, sacramental, intentional, and participatory form of creation. The Orthodox response to the bewildering proliferation of artificially generated images should be to simply point to our icons as visual examples of an ontology of fullness. As icons ourselves, we should likewise conform our lives and creations to iconographic ideals, not those of artificially generated images. In other words, strive for integration, intentionality, wholeness, and meaning in ourselves and our artifacts. So the third aspect of God's image and our image is that we have inherited the relationality of the Trinity. Depersonalization and social estrangement is an increasingly problematic aspect of the internet age, and AI has the potential to amplify this effect. In the 1960s, Joseph Weizenbaum, an MIT professor of computer science, created a proto-chatbot he called Eliza after a character in Bernard Shaw's play Pygmalion. In Greek mythology, Pygmalion falls in love with an ivory statue he carved, which then comes to life, as many of you probably know. Weizenbaum programmed Eliza to simulate questions and answers of a psychotherapist to show, and basically he did that to show the limitations of computers, but he was surprised when people who interacted with Eliza, and this was an early chatbot, anthropomorphized the program. And that reaction is now called the Eliza effect, of kind of reading human intention into, in this case, an algorithm. Weizenbaum was struck by how Eliza, in his words, created the most remarkable illusion of having understood and a wonderful illusion of spontaneity as it parodied a psychotherapist. Yet he was most surprised at how quickly and even willingly people were fooled into overestimating the intelligence of the program. He insisted that characteristics found in good therapists and any other expert are wisdom and judgment, which distinguish humans from computers that excel in calculation and instrumental reasoning. So that was his distinction that he made. Weizenbaum argued that the knowledge behind the program was that of the program's creator and the team of experts who were involved in the training. They remained hidden behind the algorithm. Even today, when machine learning has developed significantly since his book in '76, there are a host of humans doing what's called ghost work to fill in the machine learning gaps due to the brittleness of much of AI currently. There's a good book called Ghost Work on that particular subject. These humans work unacknowledged behind the scenes, often being paid pennies for performing repetitive tasks such as tagging images that a machine could not interpret and tag. So they're kind of filling in the gaps of the machine. The work of this unseen labor force in turn amplifies the Eliza effect to lead the public to view AI as more robust, flawless, and autonomous than it often is. Weizenbaum says, quote, "Human beings are to be treated with respect and contemplated with awe and wonder. Computers, too, may inspire respect, awe, and wonder, but really, save for idolatry, only as reflections on their human architects," end quote. Yet this line between man and machine has become increasingly blurred since the convergence in the 1940s of what's called the computational theory of mind that compares the mind to the machine, and the rise of information theory, which redefined information as no longer bound to specific content, meaning, or even a conscious subject, just a kind of purely mathematical patterns and probability. So redefinition of the mind and of information. This has caused us not only to view machines as more human, but view humans as more machine-like. Jaron Lanier, again, turns the famous Turing test on its head by suggesting that a machine could theoretically pass the Turing test, not because it has reached human intelligence, but because humans have become more like machines. As we shape ourselves to our tools and people come to relate more to chatbots and virtual avatars, the messy, difficult, but authentic relationships with real other people will not necessarily be the default for all. Most people agree that part of the solution to this issue is to spend more meaningful face-to-face time with others, but Orthodox Christianity must go beyond mere fellowship. We must continue to strive towards sacramental and iconographic relationships with others. In other words, we must approach others not instrumentally, but as parts of our own body and honor the image of God in them. This means choosing communion over information in Paul Kingsnorth's terms. Communion here It takes its example from the perichoresis of the Holy Trinity and is embodied in the life of the church, especially in its celebration of the Holy Eucharist, but also in the mutually self-emptying life of the faithful, both within their community and beyond. People may be fooled into relating to chatbots as if they're humans, but they're a pale substitute. They give the impression of relationality, but it's a one-way street. In the face of this, Orthodoxy offers communion as true relationship in its ontology of fullness. See, I'm finishing up the paper, and then I have some images to show you. Encountering a worldview that sees the material world as dispensable, especially transhumanists, humans as data producing machines, and machines as persons, we need to put forward the Orthodox perspective of the physical world as sacramental and humanity as co-creators who help sanctify creation by offering up words, images, and relationships Eucharistically. Our tools, such as generative AI, can mimic these creative abilities and thus our image. But one image should not be confused with the other. A simulation of a rope is not a rope, and a fox is not a king. We must affirm and root ourselves in the reality that underlies a simulated hyperreality. We retain the prerogative to increasingly conform the divine image in us to the divine likeness, and must use our tools to that end without outsourcing or automating most of our meaningful creative work. So far, there's not been much substantial Orthodox theological engagement with the most recent wave of artificial intelligence. The few exceptions are Father Nicholas Ludovicos's upcoming article in Analogia. I haven't read it, but maybe it's out here, I'm not sure. Paul Kingsnorth's essays, Doru Kostash with the Australian Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies, and David Bentley Hart's piece in Psyche magazine. I'm told that there's also been a paper or two recently from someone here that I talked to. Gail Wolashek, is that right? Yes. Yeah, I think she gave a paper, yeah. Pope Francis has given several statements that address the disruptive potential of generative AI and the issue of alignment with human dignity and values, but I have not read any pronouncements from Orthodox bishops on how Orthodox Christians should respond to this issue. We don't know the future. The effects of these technologies are often fully understood only in retrospect, especially when they're moving this fast, and it's incredible how fast they're moving. They could prove catastrophic, as some are warning us. I don't know, but Orthodox engagement with the issue should be based on an informed understanding of what these technologies actually are, not imagined ideas about them, understanding the worldviews that underlie them, such as kind of philosophical views that led to the development, and also the present and future effects, both constructive and destructive. Most importantly, we need to affirm the aspects of our tradition that can speak to the thirst of those who feel lost among the simulacra. My hope is that this current paper takes a step towards that more informed engagement. So I've got a couple of images I wanted to show you. First is probably a familiar image. This is an icon of Pentecost. So I did a couple of tests. I asked ChatGPT 2 questions. You just look at this for now, and we might come back to it in a second, but I've got a QR code. I promise it's not the mark of the beast. I'm not going to take you into a portal to hell, I promise. So if you scan this, I thought instead of doing a handout, or instead of putting the long prompt and the response on the screen, because it's a lot, you can just scan it and it should take you to it, hopefully. So I asked ChatGPT 2 questions. The first one was, what is Byzantine iconography? Just a verbal description of what it was. I was quite impressed. That's the kind of thing a student would really love to use in one of your papers. I don't know, I'm not a specialist, so I can't say for sure, but it looked like a pretty good summary. Of course, there's always additional things that could be added. I think it's maybe 11 points or something. But you can have a look either now or later and tell me what you think. So that was the first prompt. The second prompt was, what is an Orthodox, or I think I said, what does a Byzantine icon of Pentecost look like? I put Orthodox, okay. Yeah. So I asked it for a verbal description of a Pentecost icon, and that wasn't quite as good. there were some things there that were off, that were taken from the account of Pentecost, the biblical account, but you don't usually see in icons. I think one of the things I mentioned was, or that I noticed was, instead of tongues of fire, you have the dove mentioned, like that from the baptism, theophany. So he got that wrong. He talks about other people who were present in the icon besides the disciples and a few things, but overall a pretty good description. Now, when we get to the image generation, that's a different thing altogether. So I've got a couple of images. So I did the same prompt with DALL-E, which is the image generator, and I asked it for an Orthodox icon of Pentecost. And this is what it gave me. I don't know what to do with that. That's obviously it resembles an icon of Christ. So it is bringing together all these images and mashing them up into one. It resembles Christ. There's nothing about it that says Pentecost to me. That was the first option. So when you put a prompt in for DALL-E, it spits out 4 different results, but then you can do variations on each of the results. So you can kind of get infinite variations if you wanted to. And there are some abilities to edit those variations. This was the first one. The hands are often pretty marred, and the faces are usually not recognizable. So they do have an often kind of eerie look to them. So let's see. Here's number 2. Also, icon of Christ appears, but in the frame, but nothing about Pentecost.
Does it know what is Pentecost?
It does. Oh yeah, it's been trained on the entirety of the internet. So let's hope. And yeah, they've updated it. So it used to be that it was the internet up to, I think, 2021. They've upgraded it since then. So a lot of these tools are, know the contents of the internet up to now. No in quotes, I should say. So this is image variation number 2. Number 3, and this was to the same prompt for a Pentecost icon. What resembles the Virgin Mary. There's some kind of angel wings that sort of look like angel wings up there that are kind of disembodied. They're just floating up there. And the last one is this one, I think is the most horrific. So there's kind of the eerie, grotesque appearance to a lot of these figures.
Especially violent ones, especially big ones.
Yeah.
It's much.
No comment.
Okay.
And actually, some of these images that I created do remind me a bit of the kind of defaced images you see sometimes that by raiders or iconoclasts that have tried to take away the power of an icon by scratching out the eyes or the hands. That's what it reminds me of. Do I have 1 minute for?
Oh, 1 minute.
Okay.
Okay.
So I just want to say a few things specifically on icons. So other than the details, how are these images different from icons? In other words, these. Simply stated, while DALL-E, an image from DALL-E retains the style of an icon and can vaguely resemble the one depicted, there's no fundamental connection to the prototypes, for one. Even in the case of digital icons and cheap reproductions, there's still an essential resemblance to the prototype and a link to canonical and traditional depictions. These images are seemingly created almost instantaneously, as opposed to the painstaking preparation, effort, and prayers required for traditional icons. I say seemingly because these images are really a conglomeration of images that were originally created by humans. ChatGPT and DALL-E, I guess that could change if people start feeding these images in and it picks up on these. So it could be trained on these as well. ChatGPT and DALL-E were trained on a mind-bogglingly enormous data set that certainly included images and descriptions of icons. Iconographers, on the other hand, are usually trained by a teacher on a selective data set and taught to remain faithful to traditional depictions and only make relatively small changes when they're, feel pretty like they're experts at that point. Their icons must contain certain essential elements and minimize extraneous elements, whereas DALL-E's images are filled with irrelevancies that are only loosely connected to the subject. Perhaps an AI model that's trained only on these data sets of icons would show an improvement. But as they are now, these would, I would say, would never be mistaken for an authentic icon. So that's it. Thank you for your time.
So thank you very much, Chris. If I'm not mistaken, we have about half an hour, until quarter past. Okay, for coffee break. So the floor is open for discussion. Okay, please.
So let's stay on the topic of the icons.
Okay, 2, 3. Okay. Yes. First. Okay. After that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. It's working. So if we stay on the topic of the icons, I think that there is a fundamental mistake in the algorithm. The examples that are fed in the algorithm are wrong. So I wanted to go this thought on a different level. Actually, new iconographers in Greece work actually like computer programs. Mm-hmm. They just repeat the same pattern. And this approach is much more creative, actually, mm-hmm. than what we see in contemporary icon painting workshops in Greece. So we must rethink about these relationships, about what is the icon, how is it made, and if finally the artificial intelligence maybe has something more of the image of God inside it compared to the human laboratories. Maybe we should have a concrete set of data in order to make this comparison, right. But just what I have seen here. Just thanks.
Well, that sounds like sort of a mechanized workshop type model.
What do you say there?
Yeah. What's that?
There is.
Oh, okay.
Of cars, all identical.
But there are humans in the loop, which is, these are artifacts that we're using for worship. So, in my mind, you want a human who's in the loop of actually constructing it in the form. So it may look more creative, but for me, there needs to be more human intervention in the creation of the image than just the programmer creating the algorithm that is blending together all of these images and giving you something more or less random that does resemble an icon, but often doesn't relate to the topic.
Obviously not itself. But
yeah.
The main question is that if some human person chooses this and says that this is an icon, I think it becomes an icon.
Okay.
It's the same way that, maybe, this famous recording of a famous case of frogs. And he said that frogs, when they made sounds. These sounds, of course, are not musical. But if, okay.
Dr. Kesareas is and then please. Yes.
Okay. So the history about Felix Hess and his recordings of frogs mating. He said that when the frogs mate, of course, the sounds they do is not music. But if you take this recording and you play it to a human audience, this is music. And he's very right about it. And I think the same applies here. What the computer does, obviously, is not icons. But if you take this thing into worship, then it becomes an icon somehow.
Well, I would agree in terms of art in general that, you can create very interesting art with image generation, but I don't think that you can take that to the level of icon because of the different purpose of an icon than just traditional artwork of simple expression or personal expression, but a purpose in worship. So I would make that distinction. I don't know if it will hold, but
okay, thanks.
It does an icon. Yes. Okay.
Yes, I would like to thank you, all speakers, for the interesting and rich presentations. And I would like to ask Father Timothy, where we know that there are great theoretical debates, one may say even fights among modernists and postmodernists. And I would like to ask you, don't you think that this celebration, or one might say adoration of subjective truth by postmodernity, and accordingly the condemnation of the objectivity of modernity as a kind of authoritative objectification could obscure the fact that people, anthropy, are not just abstract human beings that look upward, but they are social actors embedded in real social relations. So this turn to a condition of personal metamorphosis may hinder or even obscure the need for a change of the social relations, so as such bad things like poverty or power suppression that also Orthodoxy condemns should change. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for the question. So there's part of the question relates to which aspect is the horse and which aspect is the cart. Because yes, there are major problems socially on local and global levels. The question is, can you save a society if all of the people in it are drowning? I would say no. So there's always somewhat of a debate between anthropologists and a sociologist, also in terms of, do we put the focus of study on individual in relation or the society with its relations? And I think depending on what kind of questions you're asking, the two scales will be the more, one scale will be more relevant for the kinds of questions depending on what focus you're asking, if that makes sense. I was incredibly uneloquent. So it's a question of scale. In the case of an Orthodox approach to these issues, Christ regularly was dealing with individuals. He would say, the Pharisees, the scribes, etc., you hypocrites, and use general categorical statements of critique. But whenever he was helping somebody, it was very individual. And so in the same way, I think that the ministry of the church is most adept at the individual level. There are some settings where it can push its weight, but then you get into questions of symphony, I think. And certainly I don't have any status to say something big. But so both in terms of an anthropologist, I'm interested in humans, what it means to be human in those relationships. And as a priest, I'm interested in helping individual people show up. So that's where I think, for me at least, the horse is the individual and the cart is effectively, society should start changing if the individuals start having these relationships. Healthier relationships will produce a healthier society, I think. That's my optimism for you. But if you start saying, we need to put pressure on this institution or on this social problem, you have to make sure that the people involved are already at some level of being able to make those judgments correctly. And obviously urgency must, right? In some situations, maybe we just go wholesale and try something and see if it works. But I think for me, it starts with the individual.
Thank you. Professor Gregory?
Okay, thank you, Christopher. Very triggering talk. Two questions. How can be explained the difference in the quality and accuracy between text and image generation? Are texts easier to copy and to process? This is the question. And the second, I ask an exercise of imagination and speculation to articulate some thoughts on the power of IA to learn. And not only learning, but personalized learning. So to learn how to do things as expected by the ghost worker behind. You said that ghost workers fill gaps, and it is possible that IA learns to adapt and to satisfy his ideas, parameters, even taste somehow. So, and he will be superfluous sometimes, sometime in the future.
Yes, also for Christopher.
We can sum up.
Okay, so thank you very much to all of the speakers. I will limit myself to one small question to Christopher. When ChatGPT came on the market, I introduced a few keywords and I asked it to give me a poem about it, and it was quite okay poem. I mean, I was devastated, you know, because then I saw also I tried to give in keywords to ask for like a paper, you know, like a student paper on a specific topic. And actually I realized that it does the same work as we do, intellectual work of synthesis. So you do a synthesis of several books, of several, you know, information, that inputs that you have, and then you produce something new. So it does the same thing. Where is our superiority in this? There is a limit. I think to some extent it can overpass us because it has a big possibility of computation. But still, where is our superiority as humans in this? Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to get to all those questions. First, I thought about issuing a trigger warning with the icons. So I'm not sure if that was what was triggering or not, but I am not sure about the difference in the quality or the quality between text generation and image generation. It could be just that the text is further along. Technically, I'm not sure what would cause that discrepancy. I mean, some of the image generators are pretty good. Maybe I needed a more specific prompt with more detail, because you can do that. Like if you prompt it to create something for you, if it's not to your taste, you can add some detail and then it will change it. So I'm not sure about that one. So your other question about the ghost work and learning. So were you asking about the workers who are doing the ghost work and those gaps eventually closing because of the AI improving? Certainly, yeah, certainly. Yeah, I think that's very likely. There may always be, I think there will always be, and hope there will always be tasks that we can do. But this is sort of, people were really worried about the robots taking over manual jobs and factory jobs. That's happening, but people were not worried about white collar creative jobs, but now that's happening. So hopefully we'll all still have a role in some meaningful task we can do in the future. But I definitely see a lot of those gaps eventually probably being filled, but right now they're not. And so people are in those roles. So hopefully that helps respond to your. So the other question on what role do we have, I guess. One thing that I've read that's kind of interesting, and this goes to the modernity question, is that typically we like to distinguish ourselves from the rest of the natural world and machines because we have rationality. But now with these new tools, we're changing and saying, never mind, that's not what makes us human. We're not above the rest of the natural world because of our rationality, because a machine can do that just as well. So we're having to come up with other things that make us human. I think a big part of it goes back to subjectivity and relationality, true relationality, prayer. I mean, people are trying to do things like create AI-based robotic priests. Not in the Orthodox world. I don't think that's on the horizon, but in some places in Japan, I think there's one in Poland, and I'm not sure where else, but it is AI and robots are making inroads into religious cultures as well. But I think that something about our relationality to each other, our transcendence, subjectivity, those are all things that, as far as I know, algorithms don't have. So we can't rely on our mental acuity anymore. And this kind of relates to the other paper about the limits of human reason and the project of modernity. So, does that help?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for interesting presentation. I have a question for Professor Johnson. There are many experts who believes that the human intelligence isn't the same from the artificial intelligence, isn't algorithmic intelligence, but creativity intelligence. In addition, we have no progress from the 50-51 from Alan Turing. We have no progress from the machine consciousness. If you agree, do you think this is the point of distinction between the man and the machine? And what is the theological significance for this remark? Thank you.
May I also add something to that? Because it's interesting. There was a theological conference recently, last week in Athens, and this issue came up. There was a discussion with Gail Wolochak and others, whether the machines can reach this, become sentient, and there was an interesting idea by a younger colleague in a paper, Dionysios Kliris, who expressed the idea that this point of singularity, the point that the machine becomes self-conscious, so to say, for the human intelligence has something to do with the understanding of the edges of the existence after the experience of the reality of death that comes at some points, some sort of threat of the existence. So the human intelligence is somehow grows within the horizon of a possibility of being somehow, yes, shut down something. Is there a similar point for a machine that someday can feel a sort of threat that somehow can die, being disconnected or either way? That was an idea that goes further, this discussion, whether, yes.
So that's sort of the how question from 2001. Well, there is an interesting article a while back of it was a Google engineer who had a conversation with one of their chatbots, and it expressed the same sentiment of it really didn't want to be turned off. It wanted to be alive, and it's tricky. I mean, it's sort of like the what's it like to be a bat argument, Thomas Nagel, that we don't have any internal understanding of what the experience of a creature like a bat. It's sort of the same with a machine. We can't really say it's conscious or not. Besides asking, you'd have to just take its word for it, even though it's, what's happening inside the algorithm is not the same as what's happening in our minds, though the machines are often based on what's called neural networks, and then they're kind of based on human neurons, but the process is different, what's happening inside. So that Google engineer promptly quit because he thought from the conversation that the chatbot was sentient and conscious. And most people did not agree. And I'd say that the majority of the experts out there do not think that we're at the level of AGI, artificial general intelligence, where a machine can think the same way and as we do. For Turing, I'll go to that issue of Turing. He didn't actually think that consciousness was an issue. For him, it was about intelligence. And so, in other words, if the machine could convince someone that it was intelligent or that it was an actual human, then for all intents and purposes, it is intelligent, and you could say even conscious. But he didn't really directly approach that. For him, it was more, okay, if you've heard of the imitation game, it was like a parlor game that people used to play. And there would be one person who, well, basically his version of the imitation game was that one person at a terminal who's talking to a human and is talking to a machine. And if they enough times think that the computer is a human, then we can just say, that's artificial intelligence, that's consciousness, without being able to look under the hood and see exactly what's going on. It's still a black box. So I don't want to go on too long. I don't think I answered everything, but the singularity, that is an issue with transhumanists, and this idea that we can go beyond survive death. So a lot, that book I mentioned, God, Human, Animal, Machine, is a really interesting one. It talks about the religious underpinnings, you could say, of transhumanism, and how it has a lot of the same beliefs as traditional theism, like immortality, and but it's a different kind of embodiment that they're envisioning. So, yeah.
Lydia? Microphone.
I also have a question to Dr. Johnson, because I've been thinking about this topic of icons since you mentioned it and since my presentation was also on it. And I wanted to ask the question also about related to icons, but from a bit different perspective. When you say that the issue that you examine is the relation of IE to orthodoxy, what kind of orthodoxy do you mean? The whole day today, we've been talking about the importance of the historicity and contextuality in orthodoxy, that it is not something intangible, eternal, and so on. And as I tried to show in my presentation, it also concerns iconography. So the image of Christ in, I don't know, 6th century and 12th century are very different. And I was thinking, what I think is happening here, I'm not sure, of course, why it gives you images like this is because the people who were involved in certain stages of, how do you call it, ghost something? Yeah, ghost work, were just not acquainted with the Orthodox tradition, probably. Why I'm saying this, because I remember when we had Gaya Voloschak's presentation here, it was I who mentioned her to you, I think. Yeah, sure. She showed us not icons, but an image created by ChatGPT of a human. I don't remember exactly what data were given, but very little data. And the image turned out like white, male, and something else. So what it generates really depends on who gives, on the cultural context of the creation of this particular algorithm. So I think why this is happening is because you don't, the people who were programming it just, I mean, were not in the tradition. But my next question then is about this relation of IE and orthodoxy. What kind of orthodoxy then will IE will generate? Because I'm sure like research and will be using ChatGPT more and more, IE, and it will rely on certain resources. Will it be something, it's in line what Kostis was saying, will it be Orthodox iconography like that, or more than that? And then you mentioned Uspensky. Uspensky was also kind of in his own time. He was also, I mean, not only, I mean, yes, he's a great iconologist, but it is also a version of what icon is. It's not, for example, the icon does not have to be created from certain minerals, and you can use acrylic, and then, So my question, did you think of this aspect of the problem? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you. For the first question, I guess that was the second question about the algorithmic bias. That's one of those social problems that we're going to have to reckon with, and it will affect things like researching. If your students are using it to research, they're going to get an output from a certain data set that could perpetuate prejudice and stereotypes. Yeah, the data set, the output depends on the data set and the programming. So there can be that often unintended consequence, but it's pulling from human data. So it's perpetuating our own problems in society, but people think that it has kind of this objectivity, sort of like Wikipedia, people quoting it saying, oh, here's my source. But no, gives that impression of objectivity when it's not at all. The other question was about which orthodoxy. For me, it's not, like I said, it's not an exhaustive list or anything. For me, it was just a few ideas of Orthodox practices that have developed over time, for sure, that express a kind of sacramental worldview. And the material world is important, our roles in it and our connection with each other. It's not so much which practices, could probably come up with some other ones, and those certainly do change. But while iconography changes over time, there's still that purpose of relating to the person in the image, and the image is kind of pointing towards that reality of the person as they are deified, I guess. So does that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Please. The next section will be outside. Okay. I see the. Okay, we can stop here. Thank you very much. Okay, ask a question. Of course. Yeah. Yes, of course.
Yeah. Thank you. I would like to ask Father Timothy if you would like to say a bit more about the relevance of this idea of singularity, unique. If you see in this in this theological term of uniqueness, a common ground between anthropology and theology, is that because as you were talking about the importance of experience, I kept thinking if you see that there is some sort of kinship, kinship between these two.
Do you mean singularity in the sense that our colleague at the other end of the table is meaning, or do you mean like the uniqueness of the individual?
The uniqueness of the individual. So you see a potential in this postmodern way of thinking, in postmodernity, the potential that we have now to appreciate uniqueness. Appreciate theologically. So against the grand theories, okay, we don't have the grand narratives, we don't have theories. Now we can look closer to individuals and listen to their experiences as unique human beings, for instance.
Yes,
instead of looking at a grand theory, make them.
Sure, I think it's important to when you have a person is to see them as a human, to see them as an icon of God, to see them as a unique expression of that divine iconicity. Depending on what you mean by listen to their experiences, that I feel like could go either way. So I don't want to say anything solid on that.
I go back to the title of this session.
Okay.
because there is a title about the relevance of Orthodox theology in our contemporary society, say.
Yeah.
What would you say the relevance of orthodoxy is in anthropology, for instance? What kind of that's because that's the type. Yeah, that's
sure. Well, so I think the okay. So
does theology have something to offer to anthropological methods, for instance?
Yes.
Can theology contribute something, or it's enough? Or
we don't have time for a second lecture.
Yeah, exactly. So I think
that
the answer is yes.
But we do have 3 minutes.
No, so the answer is yes, and I've published some on it. So there we go. Coffee. But yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. You all